The Wisdom of Crowds by Joe Abercrombie, Book 3 of the Age of Madness trilogy, and the 9th First Law universe novel, 10th book as a whole if you include the Sharp End short story collection. What I want to address first before we start getting into the main body of reviewing this novel, and I wasn't even sure whether to address this first or last, I'm not really sure where would be most appropriate to go, but whatever, this is kind of a free-flowing stream of consciousness review, so to speak. More discussion than review, that's how I like to think of it, but I'll address the expectations versus reality relative to, 2017, 2018, when we first heard of this trilogy's existence, to now having completed and read it all. And I will admit that the Age of Madness trilogy is a very different beast than what I had thought we were probably going to get when I first heard there's going to be a new First Law trilogy following up on the original First Law trilogy from Joe Abercrombie. They first announced that back in 2018 or whatever, what my mind ran towards was that, Best Served Cold, the heroes, Red Country, those were going to be the sort of a small scale, the gritty, human level, down in the mud, sort of the little people, so to speak. And that now that we were getting back to a new trilogy with Glokta and Jazal and everything back, that we were getting back to the main story arc, right? The mythology, Bayaz versus Khalul, the Magi, the old gods like Uz and Glustrad, whatever, more crazy magic shit like, the House of the Maker, the Seed, the 100 Words, etc., etc. But no, that wasn't really what Abercrombie had in mind, I gotta say. Instead, it turns out the Age of Madness, collectively, the 3 books of it, is actually the grittiest, lowest magic, most down-in-the-mud, political, Oddua, kind of lower north-centric story yet told in the entire First Law universe. Well, maybe also the heroes would be up there, but yeah, in this book in particular, I should say there's literally no magic whatsoever at any point besides, I think, one scene where Eater strength is used. Oh, by the way, this is going to be a spoiler review, so for some reason, if you read A Little Hatred and Trouble with Peace and you're still on the fence about whether you want to read Wisdom of Crowds, click off, come back another time. But I think there's one scene where Eater strength is used near the end of the novel when Zuri, or perhaps I should say Ishri, and the other ones attack Yoru's Sulfur, and I think one Long Eye scene after that with Ricky, right? But yeah, overall, this is not a high magic fantasy novel, right? In fact, I would go so far as to say that this makes the First Law trilogy itself look like Lord of the Rings in comparison, right? There's not so much in the way of seeds and houses of the Maker and other wizardry. No fireball shooting here, right? No Bayaz psionics, really. In fact, if you just changed out Oddua for Paris or something, 99% of this book really could have been set in the real world during the French Revolution or something. I don't know if that's a problem at all. Certainly I don't think it's the book's problem or the Age of Madness's problem, just maybe my problem. Maybe I wanted to explore further out sections of the Circle of the World that we've never seen before. I wanted sequences on par with the end of Last Argument of Kings when Bayaz is using the Seed's magic with 100 Words and Oddua is just going up in magical flames, right? And granted, you could make the easy counter argument that, hey, dumbass, if you want high fantasy type stuff, you want gods and wizards, there's 1,000 other fantasy books to read. And yeah, that's true. And but yeah, maybe that kind of colors my perceptions in some way, that the Age of Madness is not only not exactly what I thought we would get when initial new trilogy was announced. In a certain respect, it's almost the opposite.
Some would say I'm the reverse.
I just wanted to do that. It's almost a disclaimer. That's enough of what the book isn't. Let's go on to what the Wisdom of Crowds and Age of Madness as a whole is. Now, putting aside everything I just said, I do think that Joe Abercrombie is, and remains probably pretty much the best fantasy author I've read on just flat out prose, humor, dialogue, pacing, description of scenes and everything. And that remains the truth here. I think it's just immensely readable, immensely fun to read, very breezy to read. He has this magic touch almost where the prose, it's never too flowery or purple. There's not a lot of run-on sentences. There's not tons of wordy descriptions of everything going on to kind of a degree where you're like, okay, I don't need to know every stitch in everyone's clothing, move on with it. But it always has a real punch and drive and color to it, I guess, basically. Dialogue is pretty much always as exciting as the action scenes. It's got an almost a Tarantino-esque wit to it, as true in this book as any other. Particularly, I think, when Orso is on screen, right? And obviously, this book itself is massively dominated by the Great Change, which is sort of the engineered worker uprising, overthrowing the elites, kind of. Maybe not exactly, but I say the book seems to consist of about 50% the Great Change sequences, the rising up, the aftermath, the trials, the rebellion against it. Then about 25% the war in the North, with Ricky versus, I was about to say Stour Nightfall. That's not really the case, is it? He's imprisoned for all that. Ricky versus Calder, Black Calder. And about 25% the aftermath of both these things. Now, the Great Change sequences themselves, which the book gets right into it, pretty much first chapter, I believe. I mean, it's instantaneous. We have King Orso surrendering himself to the Burners, the Breakers, whichever group it was exactly. I don't know the exact page number, but I swear of the 500 something pages of the book, it must be page 30 or 40 or something. So we're really right into it. And all these sequences have a very edgy, kind of unpredictable air to them. It's all very, very harrowing, right? Very you don't quite know what's going to happen. It's violent, but not just in a people, armies going against each other type sense of violence, but more kind of a unpredictable, boiling, out of control violence, like the Valbec sequence that Savine was in, and A Little Hatred, kind of but at the next level, whole societal collapse, right? I do think that it's you could make an argument that the trials themselves in the House of the Peoples or House of the Commons or whatever, the former Lords Round, they get a little bit kind of, we see a lot of them. I mean, we go back there for Judge holding these people on trial. It's again and again and again, it seems like. It is very much a repeat theme of this book. And you could argue they get a little bit kind of repetitive, but usually the dialogue itself in those sequences is, like I mentioned, entertaining, particularly when a Judge flips on Risa now, right? And then ends up throwing him off the House of Chains. And of course, Savine's kind of testimony and Orso's testimony, both really well done. Great dialogue in those sequences. I do think that if this book and this trilogy ever made it to the big screen, or probably more likely the small screen, a TV show, I think I could see a Judge being a character that an actress could really sink her teeth into, right? Make pop in an almost kind of Heath Ledger Joker type of way. But in the book even, she worked as it seemed like a much smaller scale villain compared to, going back to what I mentioned earlier, the initial First Law trilogy, we had Kal-El as almost the Sauron-esque kind of greater scope villain. Judge is not Sauron-esque at all. Judge is, well, just kind of an evil judge, basically. Out of control kind of cult leader turned judge and executioner. It almost makes me, I already made a Joker comparison, it almost makes me think of in The Dark Knight Rises, when I think they're having trials almost similar to this, right? But it's not a Joker, it's a Scarecrow, I guess, holding a court. Those sequences felt kind of familiar to the Lord's Round sequences here, but I think there was only one sequence like that in that movie. In this one, I swear there must be 20 of those trials, right? Maybe not that much, but probably 10, right? Now, I'll admit that the reveal at the end of Trouble with Peace, that it seemed Pike was the one in charge of the Great Change, I didn't dislike it by any means, but I felt like maybe it was a tiny bit underwhelming just because Pike hadn't seemed that central to the narrative up to that point. Plus, it was weird. Wouldn't he be close to 80 or something in these books' chronology? Maybe mixed up with something. Maybe he's younger than I thought. But anyway, so I was like, okay, the next book is going to be very Pike-centric. Not really, though. He actually he seemed to step off screen for most of it after Orso turned himself in and before the scene where he told Vic that he knew about her organization of the rebellion against Judge. But then that did a good job setting up the reveal that Glocta was behind it at the end, right? And that wasn't underwhelming, right? That's okay. That's Glocta. He's the Tyrion Lannister of this entire saga of books, right? He's the overlord. He's the great mind behind everything. So I was like, yep, that works. To some extent, I was a little lost on maybe what his motivation was supposed to be exactly. I mean, I guess it's he's trying to get Baez out of the influence in Adua, right? But I don't know. It seemed like Baez was actually relatively decent to him at the end of the first law compared to everyone else. He just kept letting him rise higher and higher and be in charge of more. But so maybe in a way, Glocta almost has the our immoral torturer from the first book, so almost has a strange sort of morality, right? A morality he's willing to feed countless people into the wood chipper on of getting thrown out the house with the chains, including circumstances went slightly different in that one climactic sequence. His daughter Savine could have been among them, but so maybe he is sincere about not just wanting more power, but getting Baez out of things. Now, if Baez could insert himself to the degree that he did in the first law sequence, I don't see why he couldn't again. But you know, it was kind of interesting that at the end of the first law, it seemed like a lot of things that seemed to be secrets are now like open, right? Like even something as small as like Queen Therese being a lesbian, right? That was a secret known to almost no one, like Glocta and a couple other people at the end of Last Arguments of Kings. Now cut ahead, and it seems like pretty much every single citizen in the Union is well aware of this. Baez being behind everything, because it was like Baez was almost maybe a false hero figure at the end of Last Argument of Kings, but now they're, I mean, down to the smallest commoners, everyone's chatting pretty openly about the fact that he murdered thousands using the seed against the 100 words, about his just finger in every asshole, right? Being Valiant and Balk even. Just his general corruption and muscling in on everything in Adua. It seems like this is all pretty open knowledge, everything about Jezal. I guess the one thing that isn't open knowledge is Jezal not really being King Guslav. That's his name, right? Real son. That still seems to be on the DL. That still seems to be underground. I don't think even Orso or Savine know about that. But other than that, it seems like most of the things that were secrets, you know, at the end of the last trilogy are now pretty much known. So could Baez even insert himself again? I mean, he could come in and start blowing people up with psychic explosions and fireballs, right? But could he reinsert himself politically now that just every single commoner in the entire Union knows about his corruption, his shady dealings, his murderous intent, his dismissiveness towards life? Could he? I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, but the reveal of Glocta being behind everything, I bought it, and I didn't reread Little Hatred or Trouble with Peace or anything to see if it all worked plot-wise, but I know that Abercrombie had written this entire trilogy before even the first book had come out, at least a rough draft, so I assume it was all pretty well planned out, so I assume it would track, and yeah, that works a lot more for me than Pike being behind things, and isn't Artie also partway behind it, right? Doesn't Glocta even say it's partway her idea? So yeah, that works. I don't entirely get how he kind of envisioned things going if Judge was kind of the rogue element that allowed them to even foment a counter uprising against her. Like, what if Rhys now had been in charge of it? How would they have done the counter uprising exactly? But whatever. Yeah, Glocta, cool. That works. I like it. And the entire climactic sequence, I put quote marks around it because it's actually about 3/4 of the way through the book. So it's not quite the climactic sequence, but you know, when Leo rides into town with Marshal Forrest or whatever to help save Savine, that's not actually his intention, and Gorst wants to save the king, and Vic and Gorst trying to get the gate open, and Savine and Orso are fighting Judge on top of the House of Chains and all that. Very exciting sequence in the mind's eye. You know, if that was getting back to like the TV episode series analogy, I can imagine if that was all one episode, it would be a very, very thrilling, climactic, huge episode, right? But I mean, there's more climactic sequences after that. Bremerdan Gorst's death later, when he's trying to help Orso escape. It was perfectly first law in that it was massively badass. Just all of these men throwing themselves against him on the dock, him just slicing them apart one by one, just dropping like casual lines to Leo about tell your mother, you know, I held her in high esteem and all that. And very badass, very awesome action in that sequence, gruesomely violent in the mind's eye. But here's the but that makes it a true first law sequence, ultimately cynical in that his climactic sacrifice didn't even save Orso. Orso's Orso died anyway. And Orso's death was well handled too. Not badass. It was very Orso-ish, Orso-esque in the way he was self-deprecating to the end, and it just drew on. The book tricked you into thinking there was avenues for escape out of the canals, hiding with Ricky, but ultimately it just drew inward and inward and inward with a dread inevitability and unescapability. And it was well done. And also, of course, that final line about how's the leg? Awesomely done. Dug Orso the whole book. I have thoughts about the War in the North sequences that I'll get to in the next section, where I discuss the trilogy as a whole. But I will say, I think it's become kind of a signature element of these First Law books, Abercrombie's Little People sequences, where we have the chapters that are just fragments of like a page each or a page and a half each of tons of different characters showing these events. I think they're a little played out, if I'm being honest. We've read them over and over, but that said, I thought the one with the climactic Ricky versus Calder Carleon battle was very well done. It was one of the better ones of all the Little People sequences in the entire series so far, and that it communicated in fragments that should have been seemed disconnected and should have felt disconnected, but it nevertheless communicated the shifting momentum of this battle, where at first it seemed like Calder had all the cards, then gradually the nail comes back in, which I think we all knew was going to happen, and Iserne fail, and so on and so on, and just we see these little snapshots of the battle, one after the other, but it communicates, each one just brings a little step closer to it being a Calder advantage to being a gradual Ricky advantage. And that was really well done, I thought. That was an exciting chapter, especially when that new bad guy standing in the barrows with all his bones just kind of turned out to be a little bit of a pussy in the end. So that was a real good chapter as well. So good climactic sequences all around in this book. Maybe not quite on par with that battle in the high places from Last Arguments of Kings, but that was an epic fucking battle. But this is pretty good in its own way. Favorite character was probably, as I mentioned, probably King Orso for his sheer self-deprecation. It's a very winsome personality trait to me. Maybe that speaks to my own low self-esteem, but yeah, pretty much all of his, in all dimensions, his inner monologue was always hilarious. His little comments about everything from, the food being garbage to it's seeming about right that he keeps ending up in worse and worse cages, all the way to making wisecracks at his own execution. So I dug King Orso the whole way. Great dialogue from him. Leo Dan Brock was also, you don't like him exactly, but very good character development. I have egg on my face because when I reviewed A Little Hatred 2 years and change ago, I remember saying in my review right here in this channel that Leo struck me as the closest thing the First Law universe has ever had to a straight-up fantasy hero protagonist, right? Leo Dan Brock could be the protagonist of a heroic fantasy novel from the 80s, and he would fit in. I mean, it wouldn't not work. So in that sense, I mean, we have kind of here a true kind of classic fantasy hero. Well, Abercrombie got one up on me on that one. That's egg on my face, because nope, that's no longer the case at the end of this book. He's borderline cartoonishly villainous. He's just a backstabbing. He's just the last time we see him at the Council of War or whatever, he's just like, yeah, let's just fucking invade Styria or whatever. Let's just start another war. Let's just stab more people in the back. Let's just kill more people. He's basically completed like a transformation into fucking like Grand Moff Tarkin and shit. Right down to the visual aspect almost. So yeah, I guess I'd have to switch back to Shy South from Red Country being the closest thing the First Law sequence has to a fantasy hero protagonist, which, she's a thief and a murderer herself, as I recall. So that says something about the First Law, I guess. But yeah, Leo, nope, no longer a hero. In fact, I believe the last chapter of him is in fact called The Villain. So that's almost like a direct Abercrombie kind of putting his ass in my face on saying he was just about a hero in Little Hatred. No longer the case, I'm afraid. But very well done character development. I will say maybe he seemed a little bit too intelligent in this book almost. I think there's almost like a comment from Savine about that. Like, man, he's reminding me a lot of my father these days. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. He seemed like more of a dumbass in first book or two, but I don't know. But yeah, so it was a well done character development. More believable than Anakin Skywalker, I'd say, because he didn't just switch and start murdering younglings over the course of one scene because he heard that his wife was going to die in childbirth. It was really more losing the leg that seemed to truly drive him crazy, which might drive me crazy too, so, I can believe it. I liked Savine, not quite kind of a clone of her father, scheming in certain ways, but I would say she's a little bit more moral, arguably, than Glocta. Yeah, I know that her kind of feeding the poor and everything, and this was to some extent performative in previous books, but at the end, she could have had a Kernsbick or Celine Dan Hugen, was that her name? She could have had them killed, could have had them disappeared quite easily in revenge, but she didn't, and there's self-serving aspects to that, but, I don't see her as fully malicious. I don't see her as a villain like I do Leo, I would say. She, in the last book to some extent, because she threw herself so wholly into this rebellion against Orso, which caused a lot of the problems in the first place, but in this book she had a certain morality to her by this series standards, I wouldn't rank her as more immoral than Glocta in the original trilogy, or Logan once we knew everything about him, or even like Monza Mercato. Ricky of all the kind of new generation characters was the one who really does kind of seem, to some extent, like the true next generation. Like, she very much is like the slightly younger female Dogman, I think. And that works. So she's kind of the scrappy northern character that I don't think you can really read this series if you don't, to some extent, enjoy them, because there's so fucking many of them through all these books. Speaking of the northerners, I guess Stour Nightfall did turn out to be a little bit of a dud, I think, compared to the figure we were introduced at the beginning of A Little Hatred. Even I remember first reading A Little Hatred's little dust jacket description. First thing I ever heard about this new trilogy of books, and the very first thing says something about the marauding armies of Stour Nightfall. That just name almost stirred the imagination, and like, oh man, this is our big villain. No, he's a little bit of a loser in this book. He's kind of whines and cries and stays in a cage, and then it gets executed. So yeah, but I feel like that one is intentional. Abercrombie's kind of making a point there about perhaps seemingly great heroes aren't necessarily great heroes. Equally fair flip side, perhaps seemingly great villains aren't necessarily great villains. We all contain shades of gray and weaknesses. Stour Nightfall certainly did. Who else is there? Oh yeah, there's Gunnar Broad. I didn't mind him, to be honest. He felt a little bit played out by this point. Both the character in particular, who I kind of got his character arc from Little Hatred. I understood where everything was going, and it continued to go that way. Also played out in the sense of this character type. He almost is kind of, Babby's first Logan Nine Fingers, and that the man can't, the big lumbering man can't escape his violent past and get sucked back into it. We kind of did a whole trilogy about that. That's not to say I didn't mind his chapters. They worked, but yeah. Vic Dan Teufel. I don't know. I could never quite get my claws on who she was exactly. Like, if you were to ask me to do the without describing her looks or occupation, describe her personality test, I might have to go with the she's just normal answer. Never massively popped me, although her last chapter was satisfying with rebuking Glocta's offer and just turning around and walking into the horizon. That worked. And then Clover, he managed to actually endear himself to me a little bit, which is surprising after his betraying and murder of Wonderful at the end of The Little Hater. I was like, okay, he's a villain now. But I don't know, he kind of... your standards of morality are so gray reading these books that even an asshole, murderer, betrayer like Clover can kind of win you over. He's also self-deprecating in a similar manner to Orso. There's Ricky judging him in that one chapter, and he's just like, yeah, I don't defend myself. I betray everyone. I don't have much pride, whatever. That kind of won me over. And and also his last chapter. Actually, I'll get into that when I discuss the future of the First Law saga. But yeah, he kind of endeared himself to me. He won me back over, right? So I didn't mind Clover at all. So, as I said at the beginning, this is overall a very different trilogy to what I thought we were going to get years ago when this was first announced. Heck, I'm not even just talking about thinking we'd get more of the greater mythology, the gods and monsters and all that. Or not monsters. Well, there was the Shanka. So monsters do exist, but gods and wizards. even different than what I got kind of reading the description of book one, A Little Hatred, before it came out. I remember the early descriptions being very heavily focused on machinery, the rise of machines, the chimneys of industry over audio, right? Wasn't book three even at one point initially called The Beautiful Machine? I remember the initial book cover for A Little Hatred had gears and stuff on it. So I remember thinking that this trilogy initially would have way more of a technological focus, kind of maybe shifting the world gradually from initial kind of the high fantasy of the First Law trilogy to maybe by the end of this trilogy it would be a little bit more of, like a Legend of Korra or Final Fantasy VI type technological level. And there was some of that, but it really wasn't the focus and became even less the focus book by book. Like I remember more of that in A Little Hatred, but really not so much here. I don't remember that much in the way of machines, so I guess it makes sense why he changed the title. Now, the focus, particularly in this book, The Wisdom of Crowds, was far more on kind of social and political movements, uprisings, which, yeah, that's where the name comes from, the obviously ironic name. And perhaps I'm kind of, I don't know, perhaps maybe I'm kind of thick in the head. No, I definitely am, but maybe I don't know even what this trilogy was saying exactly. Or maybe it's just that it didn't really take a side exactly. Maybe that's a good thing, dramatically speaking, creatively. More shades of gray. But yeah, both the elitist fat cats that the workers were uprising against and the commoners uprising, they both ultimately seem to suck. I mean, my instinct is to defend the workers uprising, but they did start murdering people en masse right away. So I don't know. Yeah, if you were to read these books, I want you to say, what is Joe Abercrombie's stance on all this? And I don't think you quite derive it, but that probably is intentional. Or maybe I'm just too dumb to read into something that's clearly there. One interesting thing looking at this trilogy is that it does feel like less of a trilogy than the First Law trilogy did. Let me explain what I mean. Like, most fantasy trilogies or quartets or quintets or whatever, including the First Law trilogy, end up feeling kind of like one big story, kind of divided just into volumes, just for the convenience of not publishing, one 10,000 word book that takes a decade to write, right? But this one, on the other hand, the three books really did feel like distinct, kind of more or less self-contained narratives to me, which is to say the War Against Stour Nightfall, what seemed to be the core focus of book one, with a bit of the Valbec uprising, but book two obviously seemed to be very centric around the uprising, Leo's uprising and rebellion against King Orso. And now this book very focused on the Great Change, of course. And in that way, yeah, obviously the character arcs continue for, Leo and Savine's romance, so to speak, Ricky's gradual rise through the ranks of the North. Those things continue, but ultimately it did kind of feel like these three books did feel to me like three separate stories starring the same characters, as opposed to a true trilogy in the Lord of the Rings classic tradition. So in that way, this is like the third time I've made this comparison now in this video, but it did almost feel more like you'd imagine the kind of a plotting and story structure of like a 3 seasons of a TV show being, as opposed to a trilogy of books, which isn't a complaint at all. I think it's an interesting way of doing things, actually. That's kind of a lot of how the old Forgotten Realms books would actually do things, separate main story thrusts for each book. So, but it's kind of interesting. It's not what I figured we'd get going into this, but not a complaint. Just kind of something I thought was interesting to note. As I said before, I thought the War in the North stuff in this book was well handled, as Abercrombie is good at writing this plotting, good at writing exciting scenes, exciting battle sequences. But that said, for the future of this series of books, please no more War in the North. Just please. It's been such a heavy focus of 7 out of the 9 books in the 9 novels in this sequence so far. Everything except for Best Served Cold and Red Country has had heavy focus on the War in the North. I'm starting to get sort of a...
That's it. I want out of this family.
Vibes with Bethod and his various spawn and relatives and kin. I liked Bethod just fine as sort of a ambiguous, interesting villain in the first Law trilogy. I'm not sure I liked him enough that I want to follow all his relatives across, a dozen books spanning decades and decades. Basically, in future First Law books, I would like to see literally any other part of the Circle of the World other than Carleon and Ufrith and other adjacent places. Yeah, I can't take any more Northern or Civil War. I'm all done with that. I'm all done. It's all wrapped up for me.
I'm finished.
And that seems to basically take us right into the fourth and final section of this little review commentary discussion, which would be the future of the First Law universe. So it seems pretty obvious that the ending chapters with Clover and Ricky in particular seem to set up future books, future events. We also have Savine and Leo at the end in their little meeting in the chamber with the rest of the High Council, or Closed Council, as it were. But in the Abercrombie tradition, I doubt that Savine and Leo will be true main characters in a future trilogy, same as, Jazal and Glokta and Logan weren't main characters here. I didn't see Logan at all, which I imagine. I was hoping we might get an update on what Pharaoh Malgin was up to, but no. But anyway, so with Clover, we set up Hildy, and whoever this young swordsman related to Bethod with the scar on his lip, this swordsman prodigy, will be. So going forward, it seems like Hildy and whoever his name is will probably be main characters. I would have to imagine viewpoint characters. What that future could be is, I wasn't sure quite how old they were exactly. Teens, it seemed like. I almost thought Hildy might have been in her 20s, but maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. So I imagine the next trilogy could skip ahead as little as like 10 years, but it could be 20, 25 years. They could be older adults, and there's no reason why they couldn't. So yeah, that works. That seems like that there'll be interesting characters trained by in the school of Baez. So that is interesting to me. Now, what's more intriguing, and this is taking this little review full circle of the world. So I mentioned at the very beginning that I was thinking we maybe would get more of the greater scope mythology in this trilogy, which didn't really seem to pan out until the very last chapter here with Ricky's visions, which seemed to indicate some kind of god or demon basically rising out of the ocean, out of the earth at some point in the future, saying, I have returned. Who this is exactly is unclear. My thought ran toward Glustrad, of course, but there's Euse is a possibility also. But I would say definitely a big hitter name like that. A big hitter, not just Kowloon, I wouldn't think. Not that I wouldn't want to meet Kowloon, or is he even alive still? I don't know. I can't follow these fantasy series. I'm too slow in the brain. But it didn't seem like Kowloon would be who was basically on the same level of Baez, would be an epic enough figure to rise demonic godly out of the ocean, announcing that I have returned, with the implication that obviously the world will never be the same after this return. No, I think that's a Glustrad level move, right? That's a baller ass move, So it makes me think that future books, maybe there'll be more standalones that are smaller, but at least a future trilogy probably will be more godly, more magical. And then maybe in that case, Abercrombie will have an even greater big picture, big scope plan that the Age of Madness as a whole will fit into very neatly as a lone puzzle piece that will make me seem ridiculous for even complaining that it wasn't exactly what I wanted, exactly when I wanted it, because he knows what he's doing. And obviously, if we do end up getting, human armies versus gods or demons with magic and whatnot in the next trilogy, that will be the case. Then I'll say, okay, I get it. We were showing the kind of downward parabola of magic in this world, right? With Age of Madness being right at the bottom, and now maybe we're on the up and up again. But yeah, ultimately, if I was to rank the 3 trilogies so far, and that's including the standalones as a trilogy, I will probably confess that I'd probably put the Age of Madness third. I'd probably do them release order. I'd probably put First Law trilogy, then standalones, then this one, just because I thought the First Law trilogy had more universally strong kind of central figures, Logan, Jazal, and Glokta, particularly with Baez being a little more prominent, as opposed to kind of, Leo, Orso, Savine, Ricky. I liked them, but maybe not quite as epic figures as the ones in the original to me. But yeah, that's not to say that this whole trilogy wasn't a very brisk and entertaining and in Abercrombie tradition, a funny, darkly funny read. Because it was just one I had some issues and nitpicks with. But overall, yeah, I still think Abercrombie is one of the best pure writers I've read in fantasy. Obviously, there's hundreds of fantasy authors I haven't read yet. I'm trying to get around to them slowly. I'm not a quick reader. I'm not bright enough to be a quick reader. I do what I can. I read 2 pages a day. That's the best I can do. Just kidding. Or am I? But overall, prose, dialogue, action sequences, just kind of a general, almost, Lord of the Rings meets Tarantino atmosphere. Still top of the genre just about for me. Well, at the same time, maybe admitting that Age of Madness isn't exactly what I wanted. But, that's just me. Maybe some people out there are like, fuck yeah, give me that French Revolution-esque, gritty, down-to-earth, workers' uprising fantasy. But, yeah, so do I recommend the trilogy? Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think everyone should read all the First Law books. If you like dark fantasy, they're the shit. They're the shit. But that said, if the next trilogy has a, big war against Glustrad with magical spells flying everywhere and the Shenka coming back and seeds in 100 words, I ain't gonna complain. But yeah, that's about where I land on things. All right. I'm sure that at a certain point in the future, there'll be more Abercrombie books and I'll be back talking to you about them again. Later, everyone.